Welcome to Season 6 of Bios and Bookmarks, powered by the NGC Bocas Lit Fest. I'm Shivani Ramlochan, Bios and Bookmarks Project Manager, and this season's theme is At Home, the Green Remains, taken from the title of a poem by Jamaican writer and educator John Figueroa. This season, we'll be examining the links between Caribbean writers and the natural environments they contemplate, address, and seek to highlight through their poetry and prose. Our first guest is Barbara Lalla with her new dystopian novel, 1,000 Eyes, published by UWI Press. Joining her in a Bios and Bookmarks first is host and Program Director of the NGC Bocas Lit Fest, Nicholas Laughlin. Please stay tuned, get your questions ready to pose in the live chat, and enjoy the episode. And if you enjoy what we do at the NGC Bocas Lit Fest, please consider becoming a friend of Bocas Lit Fest. You'll see more information about the Friends initiative at the end of the session. Thank you for watching.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Nicholas Laughlin. This is a Bios and Bookmarks first, only because I've never actually done one of them before. Shivani is the most frequent Bios and Bookmarks host, and we've had various other guest hosts over the last year and a half, but it's my first time. And although in pre-COVID days, I did lots of conversations with writers, panels with writers, one-on-one conversations, I actually haven't done one now for about a year and a half. So I'm a bit rusty, but if there was just the right one to kind of get me back into the game, as it were, it's this session with Barbara Lalla, who I'm delighted to have here with us this afternoon. Hi, Barbara.
Hi there. Nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
So as many of you watching will know, Barbara Lalla is both a novelist and an academic. She is Professor Emerita of Language and Literature at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus. She is Jamaican, born in Jamaica, but has lived in Trinidad and taught at St. Augustine for many years. She's published 5 novels so far: Arch of Fire, Cascade, Uncle Brother, Grounds for Tenure, which is on the shelf right here behind me, and the one we're here to talk about today, 1,000 Eyes. And she's also, of course, published many scholarly works, one of the more recent of which, and maybe my favorite one of which, is called Post-Colonialism's Caribbean Rereading of Medieval English Discourse. I was actually in the class the very first time Barbara taught the course that sort of fed into this book at UWI I don't want to remember how many years ago, the Post-Colonialism and Caribbean Literature course, which was easily the most engaging single class I did in my entire undergraduate career. So it was fun for me to see the content of that course turn into a book eventually. So the book we're here to talk about this afternoon is 1,000 Eyes, which was published earlier this year by the University of the West Indies Press. And I think what I will let Barbara do is, before she gives us a taste of the book through a reading, I think I will let her perhaps set the ground by telling us as much as she thinks we need to know about it, because it's often the case with works of fiction that we don't want to give too many spoilers, we don't want to give too much of the plot away. But in this case, it's not just because we want the reader to, the suspense of what's going to happen next and keep turning the pages, but it's because with this particular novel, the way knowledge is communicated to the reader in parallel to the way knowledge is acquired by the characters is actually very important to the meaning of the book. So, it's not just, we don't just want to spoil the plot, it's also the way we find things out as the plot unfolds is actually very important. And I think we'll get to that in discussing the book this afternoon. But for now, Barbara, tell us what you think we need to know before you share this reading with us. And then let's hear a bit from 1,000 Eyes.
Okay. Thank you very much. 1,000 Eyes is a novel in which a group of children, abandoned children from various Caribbean nations, find themselves on one island. They have little or no idea what happened before. In a small sanctuary that they know only as the Trust, they shelter from outsiders they call crouters, but also from two who once belonged to their group, twins who have retained the names Poesis and Tweetums. Hyde, a big boy named Shine, had warned his sister Mish when she saw him last. There must be a school, Shine had once insisted, and he had tried to get each child to teach what they knew to the rest in the evenings before going to sleep. It got mixed up in stories and argument, and often, if the bickering became painful or any distressing topic dragged on too long, Ananda's counting broke it up. At first, her counting was broken too, after 12, with gaps and disordered numbers and a few letters in between. Now it was loud, as if to drown out the rest. But that evening's foray into the subject of before continued on in the evenings that followed, with here and there something new among stints of repetition. The tales might be true or made up. The children liked supposing about the far reaches of the island and about how the Banya still made their homes in the forests or highlands, or perhaps in some deep ravine or murky lake. It have snakes in the lake? 5 Cent had maintained his horror of snakes and inquired for them in every setting. He had told them repeatedly about the snake he had met when he was washed up, in fact, on the way to shore. He had been paddling in with an older sister who did not swim well, and he saw a thick tree limb bobbing on the waves. Just when he thought she would sink, it drifted barely within his reach, and he shoved it towards her. She reached out and snatched at it, and the thick body that had seemed part of the limb uncoiled almost under her hands. She opened her mouth to scream, and the water swirled in and over her, and in the turbulence from her struggle, the limb bobbed away with its passenger, leaving only heaving water where she had been. The boy repeatedly tried to gulp air and poke his head under water to look for her before coming up and paddling furiously again, but he could not keep it up. It was all he could do to keep afloat until the waves tumbled him up onto the sand. But 5 Cent was no coward. He was even ready to risk searching for the land bridge he did not believe in once no snakes were involved. Still, the idea that there was somewhere else to go brought a scowl of disbelief to his face. It have only water, he protested, all around. Almost everybody came here by boat, Nat argued. So water all round Wheeland, Telma agreed. But they have other places, Egypt. Is that why people make boats? Vicky added, we just tell you we came from another island. It's a line of them, one. Necklace, Brand said. Right. Mish grabbed up a stick and began plowing it through the sand to make a rough map as close as she could to what Shine had described to them months ago. Everyone knows there are other places, she said. Anyway, some of us have to find somewhere else besides the Trust. Still, it wasn't clear to her either. Shine had said the islands were alike just by being islands. But after all that had happened, some were in confusion and could be dangerous, and a few might even be empty. Even the weather had made it worse. None of the children had ever experienced a real storm, and hurricanes were fables to them, like dragons. But Shine had said 1 or 2 huge storms had made life on 2 of the islands impossible. Mish felt sure Nat knew more of what lay beyond their show than the others, but he was quieter than ever. It was the following day when it occurred to her that he might be worried about slowing them down. Suppose he was the one to get caught and be forced to give the others away. All he would say was that they must all go or all stay together. Mish grew more edgy. There was no urgency for the younger ones, and so no keeping them on the subject. Time was frittering away, and one couldn't walk off and leave them. Right now, she wanted to do just that. And if Ananda started to count or Marilyn to whine, she would just slap them up, she thought. She squeezed her eyes shut to get a hold of herself. If you think it have a land bridge, we better find it before the crouters can come again, Nat declared. And Josiah Marshall laughed because Nat still said it, like eat. But me shushed them. Yes, She pounced on Nat's suggestion, although she felt sure he didn't believe in the land bridge any more than she did. How will we find it? Walk round the island, 5 Cents said. It didn't have no bridge, but we might find somewhere else to live. Whole way? Marilyn stared at him. Whole way. Bran jumped up, ready to swing over the border of the trust and set off at once. Mish was not surprised. Shine had told her he believed one of the three of them was chosen, and she had naturally assumed it was Shine until he disappeared. Afterwards, she had realized it must be Brand. He was strong and fearless. The problem was that he was reckless too. He talked as if saying a thing made it true. He had no idea where actions might lead, because he had no memory of what had brought him to where he was. Mish had the odd clue, although her memories were cloudy. She recalled arms tight around her and an ear close above her forehead. Leave the man, an old woman said, leaning over them. You and your children going to run and hide with him forever, or hide from him? But what did that mean? Mish thought again about the Banya. The story said everything the Banya had labored to build over years, ages perhaps, had been taken away. Everything they had created was wiped out without trace, except in areas no one could reclaim. It seemed it was in the nature of life to empty of value every so often. She told herself severely there was no point clinging to the trust or anywhere else. Yet Mish was equally certain that they needed to gather their wits before leaving, if only to decide what they should take. But no one knew exactly what to be afraid of, so there was no clear idea of how to prepare, short of getting together what cloth and light tools they could carry, packing up any food that could keep fresh for a while, and filling what they could with water. Then they froze for a few more days before the enormity of it, of heading out into the don't trust. One morning, Nat and Thelma began waking those a little younger than themselves, and Mish joined in thankfully. Janice, Marilyn, and Vicky pushed the others, and soon they were all gathered under the saman, fidgeting and trying not to meet each other's eyes. Then they started walking straight for the entrance, where the sign still dangled with "V" on the left side, a dark patch in the middle, and "Trust" on the right. They were terrified about what they were about to do. Between the children and the other living things, there had once shimmered a wall that had grown thinner and more transparent with each passing month on the island. And in a while it had faded altogether, so they were all simply creatures of the wild, together yet apart. In a while, the ocelot's predatory instincts, which the children had absorbed unknowingly, along with the nervousness of birds and lizards, the evasiveness of agouti, had all come together in a way of talking, waiting, and seeing. There was a fearful sense, too, growing with each day, that somewhere beyond the children's knowledge might be other humans, bigger than themselves and growing increasingly more savage. Their thoughts turned to Poesus and Tweetums, produced in their very midst, yet transforming themselves into predators, and the children they had lived with into prey. Those boys had been so mean to the ocelots that of late the cats had turned on them when they tried to get back into the trust. Although no one had seen either of them clearly for a while, Thelma had recently reported sudden frantic hissing and tense stalking back and forth before she glimpsed one of the twins withdrawing, creeping awkwardly backwards along a thick branch that reached over one border of the trust. At least, she said it had looked like one of them, but more hairy. Then suppose Poesus and Tweetums outside were waiting for me, Indira's voice quavered as they stalled just beyond the entrance. And how come the Crouters hadn't taken them? Marilyn wanted to know. Perhaps they're more used to the Crouters' hair, Mish said. A minute's silence passed in gathering alarm. Janice's eyes widened. You mean Poesus and Tweetums working for them? Hair would be just like them, Brand said. No, it was actually worded. That idea spawned countless possibilities. They'd help the Crouters round us up? But the ocelots, they meant to kill them. Brand had cut back in. Easy, they want the skins anyway. We better get far away from where they'd expect to find us. And that, at last, launched the whole of them out of the trust. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. So as the novel opens, there's a sense that, before I get to that, one of the things that really strikes me on rereading 1000 Eyes is the way it kind of it combines multiple genres of writing, right? So you could say it's a work of speculative fiction. It's set in a place that's not quite here, not quite now, where something extraordinary has happened, and we're in the aftermath of that. You could say it's a young adult novel, both because of the nature of the protagonists and the way the audience's story might be pitched at. It's a kind of Bildungsroman, or a kind of novel of education, because the children basically grow into themselves as they make their journey. But it's a mystery novel, because as it starts, something has happened that we don't know what it is, what the catastrophe was that created this dilemma the children are in, and that gradually gets revealed to some extent as the story goes on. And it's a quest narrative, it's a critique of disaster capitalism, it's an ecological novel, it's a kind of an inquiry into how knowledge and language work, and it's also about how we create and understand our sense of history. So it's doing all of these things, but at the same time, it's also just an adventure story with lots of twists and turns and cliffhangers to kind of keep you reading. So I'm curious to know, when the germ of the story first came to you, did you have a sense that it would be doing all these different things at the same time? And what was the original germ of the story? Where did 1000 Eyes really start for you?
Well, I started it. The truth was, at the beginning, I thought of writing a children's story for my grandchildren. And then I found I really was not very good at writing for small children. Somehow I can tell them stories very easily. I read them stories, but when it came to actually writing one, it just got to be for an older audience. And I certainly did not have a sense of, well, I suppose maybe speculative was in my head, but I don't consider genre something that you write for. I think it's something that when you've written the book, some people read it and say, oh, well, this seems to be where it fits or doesn't fit. And I think the various aspects of it just developed as I wrote. But it started and it continued with an interest in children and how they think and how very different they are from each other, even if they have come from the same circumstances, let alone if they haven't. And it was out of an interest in that, I think, and a concern for the present state of the world in which they find themselves, that I found myself writing.
Well, when the novel opens, we find out immediately it's almost like we're sort of like at the end of history in a kind of a way. In other words, something very cataclysmic has recently happened that shapes the world these children find themselves in. But we don't know what it is, and they don't really know what it is either. We discover what that is as they discover it. And in fact, as the novel opens, you have one of the characters kind of describe a situation where you talk about, the thunder and breaking apart, the floating cinders of paper as shelves and even whole libraries gushed flame, then shriveled and curled away into ash. What happened next was not found in any official record, because for who was there to write it down and what was there to write on? So it's very much a situation where, history has been lost. The past has been lost to these characters, these children. Somewhere else, someone says, before was the thing to leave behind. Before was the thing to leave behind, and the puzzle to unravel. So I remember on rereading the novel, it kind of struck me, it reminded me of something, and it sent me back to Edward Boer's famous essay from the late 1970s, the West Indian writer and his quarrel with history. And thinking about that way that the different Caribbean writers, different writers in our context have dealt with the idea of history. So Boer starts off by quoting Derek Walcott saying, what has mattered is the loss of history, right? That idea of the Caribbean as a place where history doesn't exist, where it's lost to us. And so we have to invent, kind of what everything we are going forward. And so what struck me is there's a way in which what you've done with this novel is you've taken this thing this idea of what history means and what might be lost to history, or in what ways history might be lost, is a very common, very strong, very prevalent theme in a lot of Caribbean writing. But you've taken this thing that might be a theoretical construct, or it might be a metaphor, the way Walcott talks about, he met history, his grandfather history, and didn't recognize him, that sort of thing. But you've made it into a very literal circumstance for your characters. This is literally the dilemma they're in. History is lost because all the records are gone. They are children, so they can't rely on memory, and there are no older informed people to tell them anything, to tell them what happened, or at least not at first. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you think the novel tackles this idea of history and our relationship to it, and to what extent was it at all a kind of a conscious engagement on your part with this bigger idea of the meaning of history in Caribbean writing?
It's very hard for me to say what was conscious and what was unconscious, but I'll say yes, the importance of the loss of the history is crucial to the novel. That is, the whole idea of having no way of accounting for before, of having no way of accounting for how one got there. And I mean, it is the loss of history is part of our history and so on. But normally in the past, there would have been people who brought their own memories forward. But when you're dealing with very small children, one of the children in the novel was just discovered sitting sort of in a pool of water among some rocks, hardly able to speak. Not even, some of them are hardly able at the stage of speaking it. So the thing about history and knowledge, of course, I remember reading, I can't remember who said it, that all knowledge is nested in other knowledge. In other words, if you say that something is walking along the road, then the whole idea of what walking means, the idea of gravity, and all kinds of things are bound up in understanding that. Now, in the case of children, whatever nest of knowledge there may have been does not exist. It's been eradicated, and they have to try and put it together as they go along. I think that is part of what has happened in the Caribbean all along. The colonizers invented a Caribbean that exonerated and valorized them. They wrote what history suited them. Then the post-colonial Caribbean had to reinvent itself. The metropolitan world outside continuously dreams up its own versions of this not real place, backward and dependent societies, holiday isles, whatever. But that interplay of history and myth has always interested Caribbean artists and critics, Wilson Harris, Walcott, and others. I think, too, what is interesting now is how Caribbean speculative writing manages to shift a setting to other worlds in which we re-examine our own problems we're very familiar with, like in Midnight Robber. It's shifted to another world, but we are examining problems that are a part of our history. I am not sure if I'm answering your question.
Yes, it was maybe less of a question on my part and more of a speculation. But the other thing that strikes me about that question is, the first time I read the book, I came away with it with a sense that one of the things the children had to do, one of their tasks was to, in a sense, recover history from themselves as a way of surviving. But on a second reading, I now find myself thinking, history is also what happened before. The before of the story is also deeply traumatic, because it's clear that in some cases they have repressed things that they don't want to remember, and those kind of crop up as the story goes along. So I find myself asking now whether it's, for these particular characters in this dilemma, is it better to recover history, or is it better to forget that trauma and simply imagine the new thing that comes ahead, which I guess is maybe a version of what Walcott was arguing in that paper that Bohr quote, was Walcott's essay, The Muse of History, that the best thing was to grossly simplify it, and apologies to all the literary scholars who are watching, the idea that we should forget all of that and simply focus on the opportunities and the duties of the present moment, what we have right now. Where do you think that question of memory, forgetfulness, trauma, and how you deal with those kinds of painful issues, what does all that mean for your characters in 1000 Eyes?
Well, it's crucial, and to be very, I would really be a spoiler to be too specific, but I
Yes.
think yes, yes. One of the things that happens is as they go along, a few things come back, things that nobody would want to remember. One of the things that Mish actually remembers is when they come up on the island and they're crying. Her brother tells her, "Forget it all. This will not help you. Forget all of it now, and let us just try and find the others." At this time, they just know there are others somewhere and they don't know who. So I think there is, first of all, the fact that they're little and they're forgotten a lot. But second of all, there's the fact that it was traumatic and they've had to blot it out. And then there is the fact that the bigger ones have tried to simplify things by telling them, by encouraging them to forget, put it away, wrap up that idea in something soft and push it to the back of your mind and keep going. But there's also that ongoing need to, to find a coherent path forward, so that in fact there will be a connected history. You will get to a point where you do have some connected history. And I think that was, I think, very important to the characters' mental survival and growth.
Because really that they're trying to find a coherent sense of the reality that they're in, right? There's some basic questions. I mean, big existential questions that anybody asks, like, who am I? How did I get here? What am I here for? But in their case, they've got, no teachers or parents to guide them through this. They don't have books, they don't have religion, they don't have spirituality. They're missing all of the tools and techniques and resources that we think should usually be available to people to give them a sense of themselves in the world. And I think that, as I was saying at the beginning, the way the children gradually acquire knowledge of this world they're in, this island they find themselves on, that they don't even know the name of, and the way that the reader, in parallel with them, learns, because the reader knows nothing that the children don't know at the start. So we're as clueless as they are about how they got there. We might be able to start guessing from some of the description of the landscape what island they could be on, but there's a way in which we are acquiring that knowledge in parallel with them. And what's interesting to me is the way you do that through all these multiple perspectives. So there's at least, I don't know how many children, I can't remember the exact number, who leave the trust together in that band. It's about a dozen at least, or 14 maybe. And we keep shifting from different viewpoints. And there's something very interesting you do where, you use things like vocabulary, language, the grammar, the way the language of the characters, the language they think and speak in, to kind of shift among those viewpoints and to start to kind of put together a picture from all these little bits and pieces. I wonder if you could talk a bit about that narrative strategy. I know it's something you gave a keynote talk at UTT earlier this year, and then the Richard Alsop lecture in 2020, which were both kind of reflections on very allied questions about language, about kind of narrative structure, about how language, vocabulary, grammar, they start to kind of create the viewpoints of the character. And there's a real way in which using your kind of scholarly knowledge of linguistics, language, literary analysis, that very much informs the way that you construct this narrative. And you've also written about how, as a creative writer, the techniques of fiction and what you've learned from writing fiction also informs what you do as a scholar. So maybe tell us a little bit about how you, and this this idea of many voices, this polyvocal structure, is something that you've used before in previous novels. So tell us a bit about your interest in that, about the many different voices, because you said somewhere, I think in an interview recently, that it was the voices that hooked me. You said this to Jacqueline Bishop in an interview some months back. It was the voices that hooked you.
Yes. Well, on several levels. I mean, the children are from various places in the Caribbean, and so in order to make them distinct, it was possible to draw on the sort of voice you would expect from the different areas. So, of course, Thelma and Darity, they never name the country that they're from, but the minute a child is called Darity, you could kind of guess. So there are a number of them. The thing is, one of the reasons for using those different perspectives is that the children all being confused about what has happened. No one of them has the full story. No one of them has an explanation. Different ones of them have little shreds, little snippets that they can bring forward. And it is really by putting together the scraps that you are able to arrive at a story. No one of them could have told the story. The only way it could be done is if somebody eventually is able to pull those together, those stories together. And this idea of arriving at coherence in this way, I think it's also as a psychological strategy. I mean, one of the purposes of narrative is to impose coherence on stuff that isn't actually naturally coherent. You're going through life and all kind of madness are happening all the time. It's by weeding out some and putting them into an order that seems to make sense to you and so on that you arrive at coherence. I suppose that is why psychiatrists use the technique of making you recount, and perhaps it helps you to get it coherent. And it seemed to me as if the only way these children could eventually convey their story and put together what may have happened to them is by putting together the different fragments of the accounts. It was not always easy to do that. Thank God I had an amazing editor, editors, both of them. But the person who was helping me at this point, editor Alison Latter, she was really, really good at helping me to see where I was not getting the account distinct. She says, we're not seeing that this is Brand, or we're not seeing that this is Dorothy. We need to see that instantly from the beginning. How can you do that? And I think I had a lot of help with that. That's amazing. That was an amazing amount of help. But it was always a tug of war between conveying the fragmentation and managing to arrive at coherence.
And I think what's also interesting is that in addition to the knowledge that the children may what they may remember or what they may be able to deduce, as the story goes on and they encounter people from outside their immediate circle, they then get further versions of the story, which we suspect, and the children suspect, that none of them is the full story, that none of them is quite the truth, that information is being deployed very strategically in certain ways. And I mean, I think one of the things it's very interesting that all the way through, never anywhere in the narrative, even at the very end of it, when things have resolved the way they resolve, do we ever find out the official name of this island that they're supposed to be on, or in fact the names of the islands that any of the children who washed up here have come from? I'm kind of interested in. It's almost like, you could almost say this is a post-national novel, because the idea of the nation, what the nation means in Caribbean literature, is also something that we struggle with, we argue over, we try to define or undermine or whatever. But we have a scenario here where the children are in a very specific landscape. It's very Caribbean, with a particular history, even if they don't know what that history is, but a history that shapes who they are, their backgrounds, their language. But we never get any sense of their being, if there is a nation, it's something that was destroyed in the before time. So I'm kind of interested. What do you think about that? The idea of this as a post-national novel as opposed to a post-colonial novel?
I don't know. I've never thought of it. I can see why you would say that. I think a lot of the terms like post-colonial, post-national, speculative, a lot of the terms that critics use, they are things that I would have used if I read the novel and analyzed it. But I can't say that I did it with a view to writing it. I did, of course, try to maintain. I couldn't even call it a mystery, because we can all put everything together and guess which island it is. But the fact that the children don't know or aren't sure, except for one who keeps insisting, and it does a number of things. It keeps them in limbo. It helps to keep them uncertain. It also makes the retrieval, whatever retrieval is possible afterwards, think it makes it more important. Um, it means that any building back that is to happen will be harder, will be more heroic in the long run because of this splitting apart that has taken place. I think in a way, I don't know if nation is what I'm thinking so much of as community. Hello, I knew this would happen. Hang on. Let's get it back. Yeah. Yeah. Community. One of the things that the children are, just from being little bits of flotsam here and there, they come together and they have to work out how to communicate and how to live together, and in fact begin to form a community, trying to arrive at particular goals and to survive together and to understand that their survival depends on each other and so on. And that, to me, while it would be useful for a nation to have, I think to me that's it. the essence of community.
Well, I'm not sure how many nations these days have that exactly. I'm mindful that this season of Bibles and Bookmarks has this theme, at home the green remains, and we haven't even got to the whole idea of when nature and the natural world comes into the novel, which of course is very important, because as the book starts, with the exception of their little community of the Trust, the natural world is all they have. They're almost kind of adrift in nature. And, so in the novel, the natural world is not just the setting, although, they go on a journey and they pass through different kinds of landscapes, which are all very meticulously described, so that if you know a particular island in the Caribbean and you follow their journey, you can tell where they are based on how you describe the vegetation, the rivers, the topography, all of that. But it's not just a setting, and it's not like Walcott's green world without metaphors, like an open world of possibility where it's just waiting to be named. It's nature here it can be something very dangerous, and the passage you read from earlier with the snake, 5 cent sister and the snake, so that danger can come in the form of wild beasts. It could come in the form of the weather, of the topography. But nature is also bountiful, because everything, their food all comes from nature. And then there's this protective figure of 1,000 eyes. The title of the novel, of course, comes from someone who's a non-human character of the novel. 1,000 eyes is, I hope I'm not giving too much away to say that 1,000 eyes is not one of the ocelots that's described at the beginning. It turns out to be a jaguar, right? It's an ocelot from a larger cat. We eventually realize that 1,000 eyes grows to a scale where we realize that it's a jaguar. But I wanted to, maybe could you talk a bit about how you conceived about the natural world you set them in, which is a source of knowledge, it's as open or as closed a source of knowledge to these children as any other source that's available to them, whether it's personal memory or people they encounter. But also there's a way in which, whatever was the thing that happened in the before that created this world, nature is very much implicated. Perhaps it was the abuse of the natural world. Perhaps it was, as in the passage you just read, you suggested hurricanes. Somewhere else there's a suggestion of volcanoes. And then, again, not wanting to give anything away, towards the end of the book, something happens that is crucial to the plot, that is actually quite harmful to nature, but then comes the way forward in a different. So it's quite complicated. That kind of the relationship with the natural world, with the environment, to put it simply, is not a straightforward one in this book. What are your thoughts on that?
No, it couldn't be, because they're little children and they find themselves having to survive in the wild, and that is a terrifying idea. If you tell a child you're going to lock him out of the house at night, and it's his backyard, he would be frightened. So if you so the natural world would be a frightening place for a child to have to survive on its own. On the other hand, once they could come to terms with it, once they could band together, they would probably find that it was also going to sustain them, and in the long run, it was through their understanding of the natural world through which they might be able to survive, and so on. So it's really a dual thing. They have to fight it, but at the same time they depend on it, and they don't they don't destroy just for the sake of destroying. They kill what they want to eat if they have to kill it. They pick what they have to eat, but they're part of it. They are part of it rather than exploiters of the natural world. I think that um, for many children, the natural world is a fascinating thing. All children, they're interested in animals, they're interested in strange in scenes of parts of the world they don't know and so on. And I think there's that fascination. But there would also be an anxiety if they suddenly found themselves tossed out into it. It seems that this is my fate to keep losing this beast. Right.
Mine seems to be staying firmly inside for now.
Yes, I got the wrong ears. Anyway, yes. So that's it. Yes, it's a dual thing. I think going right through a tug of war and a dilemma as
Yeah.
to how best to survive in nature and at the same time to be part of it and to learn from it.
Yes, because it's clearly no primeval paradise. It's as you say, nature is as dangerous as it is beautiful. And I think that image of 1,000 eyes, which is the spots on the ocelot or the jaguar's coat, which the children also imagine as the stars at night, and that idea of that kind of sort of animal, not quite an animal familiar, because he never becomes familiar. 1,000 eyes never ceases to be a wild animal. He's dangerous, even as he, in a sense, is kind of watching over them. Something that I found really interesting is the word ocelot itself came into English from Nahuatl, which is of course the language of the Aztecs. Although for ocelotl for the Aztecs was the name for jaguar. But I was just looking this up yesterday because I was curious, and I realized the jaguar, that figure in for the Aztecs, was associated with the deity of the night sky.
Yes.
So the same night sky full of the stars, and also associated with ancestral memory. So it's a kind of an interesting resonance, a mythical resonance. It's kind of running there that doesn't appear in the book, but it's kind of running there in the DNA of the book.
Yes.
So I think now might be a nice time to ask you, Barbara, to read the second passage you prepared for us, and then when after that, if there are any audience questions, we can take a look at those. So anyone listening, if there's something you'd like to ask Barbara, please leave the questions. And otherwise, I certainly have much more I'd like to talk to you about. But let's pause now for another taste of 1,000 Eyes.
So I was thinking, Nicholas, I thought I might read from Shards, but you've read some of it already. So I'm wondering whether to go back to the alternative passage. And does it matter to you?
I think, the little bit I read was just a sentence.
All right, well, I'll go ahead with that.
So I think, yeah, okay. And I'm sure you will read it better than I did also.
Not at all. False modesty, man. Okay. Shards. This is the way the novel begins. Only my grandmother called me Kiskidi, and that was because our real names were the same. She never spoke of the part she played in the end, only of those earlier blasts that had shattered the place to begin with. She had heard about things before the flash, the thunder and breaking apart, the floating cinders of paper as shelves and even whole libraries gushed flamed and shriveled and curled away into ash. Before, she said, people seemed to have lived together without seeing each other at all. Why they couldn't see? I grappled with it. People were small, like ants. An ant, she stroked my cheek. No, she said, normal size. But they only saw differences between temples and hair and bank accounts. As if they lived in separate worlds, she said. And when the country came falling apart around them, very few cared whether the rest lived or died. They never even noticed those around, just looked right through them. I shivered. Like ghosts, I whispered. Sometimes these slivers of information were sharp-edged. Right, she nodded. So they arrived at this uncomfortable thought. Perhaps they were all of them, specters. What happened next was not to be found in any official record, for who was there to write it down? And what was there to write on? Versions of the story passed down mainly from mouth to mouth, but mostly it was just as if those who survived had never existed at all before. Still, all around, The tortured countryside itself testified that fire did tear open the night sky and smoke blotted out the sun. People groped around, disoriented by ruins everywhere, before taking up various haunts, coming and going as they found convenient, and making up accounts of how they had got to where they were, which was nowhere. And then the Crouters came, slashing their way through the bush and whoever stood up to them and snatching up whom they pleased. There was nothing left to do but hide. As for the flotsam, those other children, no one paid them any mind, for they never lasted long. Thank you.
Sorry. You'd think that after nearly 2 years of this, I'd have mastered the mute and unmute button, right? We do have some questions and comments coming in, Barbara. So there's a really interesting question here from Margaret Cesare Thompson, the writer, who says she agrees that there are many genres intersecting in this novel and that there's a sense of the post-national here. But she says she also senses a rewriting or re-envisioning of the 18th and 19th century European discoverer narrative, or the castaway Robinson Crusoe narrative. So could you comment on this?
Well, I don't think that it was intentional, conscious, but I can quite see the connections. It is in many ways a sort of castaway story, and there are so many of them, and a number of Caribbean writers have done that. Walcott and his Castaway, and so on and so forth. The idea of the Caribbean peoples themselves as people who have been ripped away and locked off from their origins and from their beginnings, and find themselves in a new place where they just have to do whatever they can to survive. I think that is certainly there.
It also strikes me after Margaret's question that there's a way in which you could say it's also a re-envisioning of the maroon narrative. And I know one of your earlier books, academic books, was defining Jamaican fiction, marinage, and the discourse of survival. I mean, the children are literally cast away or marooned in this place they find themselves, but also some of the other groups that they end up interacting with have, in a sense, taken the maroon strategy of withdrawing to this kind of remote location in order to survive. Was that something that you were conscious of at all, or is it something that just emerged out of the story?
Yeah, I can't say I was. Well, what am I? I mean, I wouldn't say I didn't sit down and say let's get some maroons in here or anything like that. But there is certainly that sense of groups who find themselves cut off from their pasts and who pull themselves together and sort of batten down so as to be able to survive. And part of the survival mechanism is to keep out marauders, or to keep out those who would come and try, those who think that they have the answer to how civilization should work here, and they will come and impose their views on them. So I would say that is quite true. And I think that one of the positions from which I wrote the book you referred to was that that is one of the characteristics of the Caribbean. It's not just that one gets cast away and sits there hopelessly looking at the shore and sending off messages in bottles. One begins to try and pull together and batten down and form a fastness from which you can protect yourself and live according to the way you think is best for you.
Yes, and Kelly Baker Joseph just left a comment that it also puts in mind of Jean DaCosta's Escape to Last Man Peak.
Yes.
Something.
No, go ahead. It's one of my favorite books. I just
one of your favorite books. There you go, Kelly. I'm also thinking about having. So 2 weeks ago there was an online conference around Dion Brand's book Map to the Door of No Return, and there was a lot of this idea of mapping cartography and wayfinding has been in my mind ever since then, because of course it was a topic that was explored from multiple perspectives in the course of that conference. And I think that mapping and wayfinding are clearly very important in this book in 1000 Eyes as well. I mean, literally, Mish becomes the one who's a sort of the repository of the map in a sort of a way, whether it's a physical map or a mental one. And halfway through the book, there is in fact a map that you share with the readers, which I suspect is not a cartographer's map of the island, but it's a graphic representation of the map they are imagining. But it strikes me that in finding their way and making this journey through a place that they really don't know anything about, using just kind of clues and hearsay, there's a way in which their map is really a story. In other words, the journey is the story they tell themselves about what they've done. So does that make any sense for you, that the journey is the story, but also the journey is also the stories encountered on the story? That the very earliest map, I suspect, for human beings, for our species, was not something that was drawn or pictorial. It was probably something that was verbal and oral. It was a story about how to get from here to there. And there's that the Australian Aboriginal Australians have these things called song lines, which are literally poems about the landscape, describe the features of the landscape. And if you are knowledgeable, if you're a knowledgeable reader of the song, or if you know the song lines, you can recite a poem, and as you do it, you can cross the territory because the poem will describe exactly what you're crossing. There's a way in which that is the kind of wayfinding the children are doing. Does that have any resonance for you, that idea of journey as story?
Very much so. Very much so. And Mish is able to find her way. In fact, many of them have some idea of certain things from the ways they have gone in hunting for things. When they go out to hunt and see if they can find cloth, or they can find oil, or whatever they can find. The ones who go out and scrounging, they have a sense. They have a sense of what the place is like, relatively near to the trust. And then as they go out, they can only rely on things that older people have said, like Shine, who has given them some idea. And he draws things on the sand for them, and then he rubs them out because he doesn't want anybody to find it and know where they have been. She is always trying to resketch it so as to have it with her. So I think the map thing is important. And when I put in that little map, and yes, it wasn't a cartographer's map, it was Mish's map. And that, of course, it was only a map showing where they had been so far and where else there might be, but the line did not continue because they haven't gone to any of those places at the point where that map is put up. Besides, it would have given away the story.
Yes, exactly. Well, we're coming to the end of the hour, but I have one more question. I hope it's not too cheeky a question that I want to ask you before we do our last thing. So I do very much see. You started writing this novel before COVID, presumably, right? Yes. Before any of us even knew what COVID was.
Yes.
But in a very kind of striking way, almost scary way, it's a book that seems even more relevant to read now in the middle of this pandemic, because I see a very clear parallel between the way 1000 Eyes explores how knowledge gets constructed from all these multiple sources of varying degrees of accuracy. So, what is rumor? What is hearsay? What is total invention because you don't know the facts? What is a fact? The way that the knowledge is put together here, and the way that, in a very real sense, the health of our society right now is being damaged by the way, knowledge is put together through rumor, through hearsay, through facts that may not be facts about things like, where does a virus come from? Is it a virus? Does it exist? Should we get vaccinated? I mean, I suppose, and I actually know that you're working on a book now that is set during COVID and that kind of tackles that a little bit. So I guess two things. First of all, did you have any inkling that your book was going to be, the novel would turn out to be prophetic almost in that kind of way, or to have this sort of a very relevant resonance? And do you want to tell us just a little bit about the new novel you're working on?
Sure. Well, I was hoping it wouldn't turn out to be prophetic, and I certainly didn't have any idea really when I started writing it about anything to do with COVID. But I was very aware of the fact that the world was in a bit of a predicament where there was a type of leadership that seemed to be bent on on bending knowledge and using fabrications and twistings of knowledge for political ends. And that seemed to be an enormously dangerous thing that could end in catastrophe of various sorts. Now, it is true that while I was writing, somehow for my sins, I was writing two books at the same time. I was writing 1000 Eyes and then gradually found myself writing the other novel, which is called By Such a Parting Light. And that does end up set in COVID times. And I was writing them together even before the pandemic. And it was while I was writing them that the pandemic started and the other novel took that turn. But in both, I know I was very concerned with the whole issue of how information is adjusted for political gain, for personal use or wealth or whatever. The thing is that in 1000 Eyes, the main characters are really, all of them, trying to find out, the children. They really all want to know what happened. They really want to know what the facts are. They really want to know where they should go. They really want actual information. And while it is true that there are characters who are trying to pitch it in a certain way, it is really in the other novel that you find yourself in a predicament in which everything depends on important information being relayed accurately, and where there are powerful forces who are opposing that, standing in the way and fabricating and twisting and so on.
And on that note, I want to say that if there's anyone listening to this Bios and Bookmarks episode who has not yet got your COVID vaccine, I think Barbara will agree with me 100%. Please go and get it. We don't want to end up in a world that looks like the one in 1000 Eyes. So one possible practical thing you could do is follow the COVID restrictions and get vaccinated or get your booster shot. But before we wrap up, we always end these Bios and Bookmarks episodes with a little game, sort of a fun moment. And the one that we'll be using for this season is called Promptly Written. So, Barbara, I'm going to outline a scenario to you, and then you tell me how you would respond in this scenario, right? So, imagine that you are about to step into an elevator. The doors open, and when the elevator doors open, the two people already in the elevator are the publisher of your dreams and the editor of your dreams. Although it sounds like your existing editor is already the editor of your dreams. Maybe you know who the person is. So you step into the elevator, the publisher and editor of your dreams are there, and you decide to give a literal elevator pitch. They're talking in the elevator about a very specific topic, and you decide you're going to pitch them your dream project for that topic, which could be a book, it could be a movie, it could be a song, it could be anything. Like your dream project that has to do with this particular topic. And the topic is, your editors probably also are Jamaican, because you hear them say a Jamaican proverb, which I'm going to struggle. My Jamaican accent is not good. So Jamaican listeners, please cover your ears. Now wait till drum beat before you grind your axe. So you step into the elevator, you hear this and you think, aha, I know what I want to pitch to them. What is it?
Well, I think I want to do a Jamaican rewriting of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight.
Ooh.
In which you will have someone who has undertaken a task and a quest and has to go out in the wilderness. I mean, I'm right in wilderness mode now with 1000 Eyes. So I'm trying to see how I can do this Jamaican rewriting of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, where, as you know and remember, somebody is offered a game in which we come to an agreement. You cut off my head this year, and next year I will cut off yours, which seems grisly, but at least it's a good deal until you cut off the person's head, and then he picks it up and says, see you next year.
Because he turns out to be a hard man for dead.
Hard man for dead. So I think what I would want to do is a Jamaican rewriting of this, in which the person is preparing, much better than Gawain prepared in the story, preparing to meet his meet the enemy or the challenger. But in this case, he is going to be far better prepared. He's going to have a lot more than just an axe, I think. That's my thought so far.
Listeners, you have it there. That might be Barbara Lalla's 7th novel after she finishes the COVID novel she's writing right now. So we've come to the end of the hour. So a few things for me to do. First of all, thank you so much, Barbara. It was lovely to spend this time with you, to hear you read from the book again, and to have this conversation with you. Thanks to everyone who's been watching and sending your questions and sharing your thoughts. Thanks, of course, always to NGC, the National Gas Company, for making these Bios and Bookmarks events possible, and to Shivani, Stefan, and the rest of the Bocas team who work behind the scenes. This is the first episode of the new Bios and Bookmarks season, so there'll be 5 more episodes to come on 5 successive Sunday afternoons. So keep an eye on our social media, join our mailing list, keep an eye on our website, to find out who's coming next. The last thing to say is, if you've enjoyed this event, message has just come up on screen. If you've enjoyed this event and want to lend support to Bocas and also have access to our wonderful video and audio archive and various other resources like that, please think about joining the Friends of Bocas Lit Fest at bocaslitfest.com/friends. It helps us do everything that we do. So again, thank you so much, Barbara. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for having me.
I'm looking forward, Barbara, to the next time I can actually see you in person, in the flesh. And I hope that will be soon. If everyone goes and takes their shots, maybe it will be sooner rather than later.
Okay. Thanks.